Hello, it is Wisdom Wednesdays. I'm Ariana Newcomer, Dove Oracle Priestess, biofield tuning practitioner, and spiritual mentor. My heart is really, really heavy today. And I'm going to talk about our toxic culture. And this is something that has been just flown in our faces, just put splat right in our faces by the things that have happened in the last number of days. The blatant, callous murder of George Floyd on camera, the words that have been coming out of our White House. But I'm going to go back to George Floyd. There was something that really, really struck me in that video of that officer had his knee on George Floyd's neck with his hands in his pockets, and there's a sort of blank look on his face, but not totally blank, but like in this callous disregard for the life of this man who was under his knee, pleading for his life. That is not something new, unfortunately. We have seen far, far too much of this callous disregard for Black life, and especially the lives of Black men and young Black men. But it isn't just Black men in this country. Black women have also been murdered by police. And it's a sickness. It's kind of an illness, really, in our culture. And one thing that occurred to me in watching this officer with his knee on the man's neck as he was dying, and people in the crowd were also pleading for the man's life. A nurse was asking, could she take his pulse? People were pleading for the officer to get off of his neck. And that look on his face was like, you can't tell me what to do. I'm the police. So I had this thought that perhaps having the crowd there advocating for George Floyd as he was dying made this officer even less likely to take his knee off his neck, because then he would look as if he were weak. And as if he were giving in to people that he was supposed to have control over, the public. This is the culture of domination. And this culture of domination has been on full display in the White House. And Trump even used that word to tell governors what they needed to do. They needed to dominate the protesters, or they were going to look like jerks. They were going to look weak. And the Secretary of Defense even used that word. And you have to dominate the battle space. We're in a battle with our own people here. And this is the toxic end of the dominator culture. And Trump has demonstrated over the years that he's been in office, and even before, that this is his ethos. His ethos is you either dominate or you are dominated. And any tactics necessary in order to dominate are fine. So he doesn't pay contractors. He doesn't pay the cities where he's had his rallies. He brings in the military against his own people, fans the flames of division instead of helping to heal, and asks other countries to help him win elections and discredit his political opponents. Uses his office to enrich himself. It's just incredible, right? Protesting is a sacred right in a democracy and in our democracy. And I grew up in the 60s. My family was very involved. My parents were involved in the civil rights movement, and my older brother and I were very involved in the anti-Vietnam War protests. And it's just heartbreaking to me to see that we have made so little progress since those times. Yeah, certain names of structures of things have changed, but the way as a culture we treat people of color, Black people, immigrants, Native Americans, people from other countries. It hasn't changed that much. And unfortunately, it's this culture of domination that's the reason why things haven't changed that much. It's still the underlying structure of our society, and those in power now are the ones who most strenuously hang on to that culture of domination. And it's our stories that kind of keep us in this. And if you followed me for a while, you know that I am a student of Riane Eisler. She's been one of my mentors. I consider her one of the greatest thinkers alive at this time on the planet. And I really love her description of the dominator paradigm versus the partnership paradigm. And it explains a lot, and it kind of weaves together all these threads of racism, of suppression of women's voices, of misogyny, of anti-immigrant sentiment, of white supremacy, of white privilege. All these things really get tied together in this dominator paradigm. And so domination systems, and these, by the way, have only really been present on the planet for the last 5,000 years. So we're not doomed to this. It's been 5,000 years of this kind of structure being the greatest structure on the planet, but we're not doomed. There have been partnership cultures in past history, and there are places in the world where there is more of a partnership culture, like in the Nordic countries, than we have here, than there is in many, many other places in the world. So domination systems are characterized by hierarchies of control, and these are rigid hierarchies. The military is an example of a rigid hierarchical structure. Most corporations are structured kind of on that military model, in this rigid hierarchy of who gets to say what happens. They're also characterized by superior and inferior relations. So somebody always has to be superior and somebody always has to be inferior. And that's one reason why you have to dominate, because then you can be superior. If you are dominated, then you're inferior. And there has to be a group that's superior and some other group or groups that are inferior. And it's highly authoritarian, both in the family and in the state. And you see these structures in some of the religions also, which in my view are distortions of the original teachings of the world's religions, which are primarily about how to be a more loving and compassionate person and how to care for others as we care for ourselves. But a lot of the religions have been sort of taken over by this dominator structure. And there are traditions of violence in domination systems. Violence is justified and idealized, which is what Trump is doing right now in this country, advocating violence against the protesters in the streets, even using violence against peaceful protesters so that he could just have a photo op in front of a church from whom he did not get permission to be there. Also, in the domination systems, the gender relations tend to be male dominated. Women and feminine values are considered inferior to men and masculine values. So you can see that this kind of gives us an umbrella way to understand what is going on here. And it also involves the myth of separation. To me, this kind of folds into the domination system. And part of the domination system is also dominating over nature, right? Humans are superior to nature, and we get to just take whatever we want from nature and disregard the destruction of the actual climate and agriculture and everything that we depend upon, clean water, clean air, to actually live So we have this myth that we're separate from each other. White people are separate from Black people. Asians are separate from people from India. People from Sweden are separate from the British. People in Germany are separate from the Croatians. People in Africa, East Africa, are separate from the people in West Africa. People in Egypt are separate from the people in South Africa. People in Brazil who are in control are separate from the indigenous people in the Amazon. It's this, and then we get to be superior. If we're separate from them, then we get to feel superior. We get to think they're inferior, and that just fits right in to the domination hierarchy. And we get to feel better about ourselves because we feel like we're superior. Somebody's inferior to us. And that's necessary in the domination system. And our stories, Riane Eisler also talks about how our stories tend to keep us stuck in these certain ways of being. And when we change our stories, that's when we can actually change the underlying systems. And so our stories and myths of privilege, of inferiority of some people, superiority of others, and a lot of us who are white have grown up with white privilege and are unconscious about how that has operated for us. You know, imagine, I have 2 sons, and my 2 sons are white, and I have friends who have Black sons, and I know how stressful that is for them to know that their sons could just be targeted one day for no good reason and end up dead just because of the color of their skin. So as white people, we need to start imagining, what would that be like if my sons could just go out innocently for a run and get killed by some guys in pickup trucks with rifles? Like Ahmaud Arbery, I think his name was. I mean, how extraordinary is that? And another thing I've been thinking about is that, you know, that people of color, African Americans and Native Americans are dying at greater numbers, are getting more sick and dying in greater numbers than others from the coronavirus, the novel coronavirus. And there's some reasons that have been floated, like the don't have access to good food, have some underlying health conditions. But stress is one of the primary drivers of a lot of health conditions. So what if we could understand that African Americans and Native Americans live under a great deal more just constant underlying stress because of the way they're considered inferior and because of the domination systems that attempt to control them, put Black people in prison at higher numbers, keep moving Native Americans onto poorer and poorer lands. Anytime any one of their lands shows any economic, something on it that has economic value to the government or white people, then they get pushed off again. So this stress of being considered inferior, treated as inferior, living in places that are more polluted, and having that constant stress of, if I go out on the street today just to go to the grocery store, just to go for a run, am I going to be targeted? Am I going to die? And Native American women suffer disappearance and rapes, and the rapists are not prosecuted. There's these gray areas between who's responsible on the reservation and who's not, you know, what law enforcement agencies. So there's a tremendous amount of stress, and that is a driver of immune compromised systems. So we really need to move into a partnership culture. So this is the other piece of the continuum in Riane Eisler's work, the Dominator paradigm and the partnership paradigm over here. And there's a continuum. And In the partnership paradigm, instead of hierarchies of control, rigid hierarchies, Rand envisions hierarchies of actualization. So we can help each other. We have, instead of superior inferior relations, we have relations of mutual respect and mutual benefit. Instead of dominate or be dominated, there's a shared focus on nurturing and sustaining life. And power, instead of in the domination system, it's power over others, it's power with others. And social and economic structures that's more democratic in both the family and the state. Violence is not justified and idealized. Non-violence and mutual respect are celebrated. And in gender relations, women and men are valued equally, and caring is prized as a human value, whether expressed by women or by men. And I would say also that in a partnership culture, we then naturally come into partnering with people who don't look like us, people of different races, people who come from different backgrounds and different places in the world. And so I am at the same time, heartbroken and really distressed and hopeful, because when people rise up, and it isn't just Black people who are in the streets, there are white people also protesting with them. Some of the police are taking a knee and marching with the protesters instead of doing the domination thing and trying to just, dominate people. So there are possibilities here. There are possibilities, and the need is great. And if we do not move into greater partnership, we are going to be stuck with this incredible authoritarian autocrat, would-be dictator, who is the epitome of the dominator culture in the White House, and who has pushed all kinds of parts of our government into more and more of this domination way of thinking. We have to get him out. So I would ask your assistants to come inside to do we have to continue doing our own inner work, and then we have to act. We have to act. So in the spiritual community, sometimes we can separate ourselves from politics and say, well, I don't do that. That's really low vibration. I can't listen to the news. I can't do that. We can't afford that now. We can't afford that now. If you want to have a world that you can continue to live in, if you want to see greater partnership cultures come arising on the planet, if you want to see shifts and changes in agriculture so that we nurture the soils again, if you want to see peace and harmony amongst peoples, we have to act. We cannot. This is this myth of separation. I can separate myself from the politics and what's going on. But politics is about us. It's about our lives. And it has a tremendous effect on how we can live our lives. Look what's happening in our country because our government is this domination centered around this huge ego would-be dictator here. And the supposed checks and balances in our constitution and our system have just been ridden right over. We have to act. We have to vote. We have to go in the streets. It's time. Let's all work, especially in the spiritual community. Just stop that myth of separation, that somehow you can be separated from politics because they don't affect you. It just isn't true. Just isn't true. It's uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable. We have to be uncomfortable. We have to get out of our comfort zone in order to create the world that we need for us to continue living. For my children and grandchildren and your children and grandchildren to have a world that they can live in. We got to stop the myth of separation. We are actually part of the whole web of life, all of us. We are all part of this web of life. None of us is an island. None of us is separate. We actually all are part of this web, and we need to behave like it. So, blessings to everyone. My thanks to everyone who is doing things, who is acting, and keep it up. We need to.